Hello, welcome to the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson and I'm here on Zoom with Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner. We're going to crack right on with our subject today. Those of you that have been with us from the beginning will remember that we discussed top 5 cellists with Julian Lloyd-Webber in one of our early editions of the podcast. Today we're turning to the music itself and specifically cello concertos. And our special guest is one of the UK's finest and most popular cellists who's premiered a good number of cello works by the likes of John Tavener, who wrote The Protecting Veil for him, John Woolrich, Wolfgang Grimm, Thomas Addis, and also has been involved in new editions of cello works by Beethoven, Dvorak, Prokofiev and Elgar. He is Steven Isserlis. Steven, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. You've spent an entire life in the world of cellos and cello music. How on earth did you even begin to choose just 5 works for our podcast today? It's always an unreasonable request, but how did you go about it? What was your criteria?
Well, the first 4 were easy because I've always listed my 4 absolute favorite cello concertos. But the 5th was a problem. It sort of makes it easier if you cut out any piece that's not called concerto. That does make it easier.
Yes. You say that, but of course, some of the big works for cello and orchestra aren't called concertos, are they? There's a couple of obvious ones.
To cut them out. To choose just one.
Yes. But did you start? A lot of our guests have picked music not just because they are the classics in the repertoire and therefore probably should be in everyone's top 5, but also because they mean something personal to them.
Well, they all mean something very personal to me, I would say. And I don't think anything's unexpected, really. Because, if I was asked to choose the 5 greatest works for solo cello, there'd be 5 of the 6 Bach suites, for instance. Great works. I suppose there's one that might be a surprise to some. I did actually see on Twitter that it was mentioned as not often heard, which surprised me because I always ask to play it whenever I can. But maybe I should start with chronologically the first.
In whatever order that you like, Stephen. Yeah,
okay, chronologically, and this was the 5th choice, is the Haydn C major concerto. I mean, it was a big tussle to cut out Shostakovich, either of his concertos, or Dutilleux, which I love. It's a fantastic piece, or Frank Bridge, Oration, which is called Concerto Oratico. Concerto Elegiaco, sorry. That's Oration, Concerto Elegiaco. But finally I went to Hyden because it's the most perfect classical concerto. What I was interested in on Twitter was that several people mentioned Haydn number 2, the D major, which actually I've just been playing in Spain, which is a wonderful piece, but it's not as perfect as the C major. C major, I always say, is very instrumental, and it's just perfectly proportioned and everything. And the D major is much more operatic. And I was not surprised when I was writing the sleeve notes for my own recording of it that to find out it was written not only the same year that he wrote his last opera, but also at a time when he was in love with a soprano called Celli. And I think you can sort of feel that through the piece. It's very vocal and it's wonderful, but there are sort of, the proportions are strange, which doesn't bother me at all, but they are strange. And there's some, obviously, there's repeated transition passages, which perhaps if he'd given it a little more time, he might have varied a bit more, maybe. It feels silly to criticize such a wonderful piece. It's like my friend Ollie Musterman says, criticizing a piece like that is saying, oh yes, that's a beautiful wild animal, but its eyes should be a 1/4 inch to the left and the right, and you just don't do it. It is what it is. But the C major is perfect, and of course it was wonderful that it was unknown, was lost for so many years until that very late 50s. And now it is the standard for classical concertos. And I love Boccherini concertos as well. Those are unique, and I love C.P. Bach and some others. But Haydn is the perfect concerto, and it's perfectly written for the instrument. It exudes joy. It's wonderful. I cannot say I'm very keen on the way people play the last movement as if it's a, trying to, a sort of racing demon. It's not written that. It's not even alle breve. It's not meant to be that fast, I think. It's meant to have charm. Of course, it's virtuoso and exciting, but it's meant to be charming and lyrical and joyous. And as I say, everything is exactly as it should be.
And what about the different approaches to it? I mean, you've performed with OAE, for example, Orchestra Age of Enlightenment, and also orchestras that are playing in a more modern style. What is your preference with that piece? Because the C major is it's a very popular work. Lots of people want to play it in lots of different settings. What's your preference stylistically?
Well, I don't know. As Chandel Vague used to say, Mozart didn't know he was writing in the style of Mozart. You have to play it as music, and I played it with, several Russian orchestras, which is rather different from OAE and English Baroque soloists and people with whom I played it also. It is what it is. And although, of course, I will vary the style. Well, I won't consciously vary the style when I play it with the original instruments and modern instruments, but it will be different because of what I'm hearing coming from the orchestra. Of course, I'm responding to that. But it's not an essential difference. What's most important is to make it precise and joyous and simple and natural in whatever style, with whatever instruments you're playing.
Well, Richard, anybody who listens to this podcast regularly will know that Richard's a big fan of Hyden, and will always bring him up in conversation, and has opened up so much of that repertoire to me and many others, I'm sure. But Richard is also an amateur cellist. I wonder whether I mean, I don't know whether you picked the C major in your five, Richard, but it seemed to me, I may be wrong, that most of the cellists that I was reading on social media chose the C major, not the D, which seems interesting to me.
Well, I mean, I'd hesitate to call myself a cellist in the presence of Stephen. Really, I've only ever been a competent amateur. Really, after a brief dalliance as playing professionally very, very early on, I just didn't realise I was better off doing it on an amateur level. The C major cello concerto, and this is what cellists don't tell you, but probably should, is that basically when you're learning the cello, the first spread chord you learn to play on the cello, the first time you get to play four notes in a big crunchy spread of notes, is C major, and it's a fantastic chord, and it down on the bottom C string, right round up across the instrument, fits comfortably in first position on the top two strings, and wow, where it does, you're playing like a virtuoso, and you're only grade 4 standard already. And the Haydn Concerto, the C major concerto, begins with this glorious ringing C major chord. So there you are, right at the beginning. It's as if instinctively he sort of gets the alpha and the omega of the instrument. He knows what sounds good. He knows that we love making that sound, and he takes that as a springboard. And it's just sort of grand ceremonial first movement, isn't it? It's I always think it's one of the earlier pieces he wrote at Esterházy, and I think I always feel it was him trying to show that he could do the grand ceremonial, show-offy, courtly thing at the same time as really showcasing this fantastic cellist he'd just recruited for his orchestra there. I think was it Anton Kraft? Right, I think
that's the D major.
No, what's the name again?
Weigl. It was Joseph Weigl.
That was the man. Sorry, yes.
And, whose son was Haydn's godson. Absolutely,
but that's right. It's just that first movement just falls so gloriously under the hand. It really feels like it fits so naturally on the cello. It's so comfortable to play. I mean, I say this because I can tell you it's the only complete concerto movement I was ever able to technically master on the cello with any sense of confidence or assurance. The rest of the piece is still glorious, but I think it was the thumb position double stops in the finale. That was never going to happen for me, and never did happen. But anyway, I feel I shouldn't really be talking about this because I know that Charlotte feels extremely passionately about this piece, and I don't really want to steal her thunder. But for that reason, I didn't put it in my list. But I mean, the reality is, it would be my number one cello concerto. Really, the first one that would come to mind, the first one that featured in my life, really. So,
all right, then go on. Cue Charlotte.
Well, yes, it was my number one. I didn't even have to think about it. I mean, for me, this is the first great cello concerto that was ever written. I mean, we'd had wonderful works by Vivaldi, Graziani, Platti, Boccherini, but none of them nailed it the way Hyden nailed it. I mean, every single movement, every single melody that he trots out, it is, as Stephen says, it is absolutely perfect. And that first movement, it's not just ceremonial and noble, it's radiant. It's like this wonderful burst of C major radiant joy. And I remember the first time I heard it was the 1975 Rostropovich recording. And I didn't get on to the second movement for so long because I just kept on rewinding the first movement. And it was also, therefore, my first collection for Gramophone magazine was the Haydn C major. I suggested it. And I've learned over time that there's a trick with Gramophone collections. For those of you who don't read Gramophone yet, what we do is we take a major work and we listen to every single recording of it that has ever been made. And then we narrow that down to 20 or so, and then we deal with them in detail. So it's a lot of hours and a lot of going over the score over and over. And what I've learned over time is that you can tell the difference between a wonderful work and a masterpiece. And the wonderful works, you get to the end of all of that listening and you love the work more, you admire it more, but frankly, you've got to put it on the shelf for a bit. You need a break. The masterpieces, there's just a whole new obsession. And I filed the collection and I can't stop. I really can't stop. And the Haydn C major for me is one of those. And I think partly as a recordings critic, there are, as you've already said, there are so many ways of interpreting it. No two recordings, no two performances are the same. Do you go for keyboard continuo or not? Is it period instruments? I mean, there are so many interesting things. And the cadenzas as well. I mean, it's a concerto where, I mean, Stephen's written his own wonderful cadenzas for it. It's also a concerto that lends itself to modern cadenzas, with modern language. Britain wrote wonderful ones for Rostropovich. And the other thing, it's funny, Stephen comments about how it's very operatic. The G major is very operatic. But one of the things I particularly love about the C major is just how vocal it is. And particularly in the second movement, you have these long lines that a high register that rise out of nothing. And Boccherini was doing that in his concertos, but this was also a trick that the castrato was using at the time. And of course, this was the age of Farinelli. I don't think that Hyden and Farinelli ever met, but you've got this wonderful castrato trick. It's a bit, Handel's Ombra Mafu is the classic example of this long held note that rises out of nowhere. And I mean, who knows whether this is the case, but I like to think that Hyden was thinking of the castrati, and perhaps his audience would have been as well. And of course, he had a brush with that himself. He was a chorister at what was the cathedral in Venice where he was? Somebody help me. Thank you. St. Stephen. And the choir master said to Haydn's dad, look, he could be a castrato, how about it? And thank goodness for Hyden, his dad said no. So, but Haydn had this narrow brush with being a castrato, and then you have this incredible first cello concerto masterpiece where you have this castrato trick in the second movement. I mean, I could keep going, but I know we have other concertos.
We do have other concertos to go through. Sorry, Stephen.
When I was writing the sleeve notes for my recording with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie of this, I thought, I'll look up Mr. Weigel, because you keep getting these, or as you say, you keep getting these long notes. Both the slow moment and the last one have lots of them growing out of nothing, as you say. So I know that Weigel went to Hoffmann's orchestra in Vienna afterwards. So I looked up Hoffmann's concertos, exactly the same. And it's like the D major, you get things that Antonin Kraft did, like he liked to play whole melodies on one string. That's why Beethoven wrote in the end of his the C minor trio, Opus 1, number 3. There's a thing all on the C string. Same thing in Hyden, that part was played by Kraft. Hyden keeps the whole second subject on the G string, marks it, and also plays out very high. If you looked at Kraft concertos, obviously he loved to do that. The only thing, I agree with everything you say, except I think you're underrating Boccherini. Because I think
well, Boccherini, I mean, it's beautiful, but he doesn't have the same. The melodies don't stick. I mean, I think the beauty of the Haydn C major is that every single melody just lodges in your head instantly. And I think that Boccherini's concertos, they're wonderful. They're really wonderful, but nothing quite becomes the earworm.
You wait. I want to make another Boccherini recording because I think he was a genius. But he's on his own. He's nothing like Haydn or Mozart.
I I think we have quite a few earworms coming our way in this program anyway. The cello repertoire is certainly full of them. Stephen, did you say that you didn't choose the Shostakovich?
I did.
Oh, you have. Good. Well, let's come
No,
to
I
that.
did say that. Sorry.
You did say that, but you haven't chosen it. Right.
Great.
Because I mean, there are two concertos that came up way more than any others on social media when I put this out. One, I'm certain that we're going to talk about a certain British cello concerto, and the other one is the Shostakovich No. 1, which of course is a Rostropovich piece. And I wanted to ask you actually where we might be as far as the cello concerto repertoire is concerned without that figure of Slava Rostropovich. I would first just say that I mean the Shostakovich was absolutely on my top 5 list. I just think it's so arresting, it's so exciting, it's so involving. I get right inside it, depending on who is performing it. There's that wonderful vintage film of Rostropovich. I think the BBC did it in the studio with Charles Groves conducting. I think it's the LSO playing. And it's just fabulous. It's a brilliant way of seeing the piece too, because you see so much of Rostropovich in it. You feel it, that piece. And of course, he was so close to it. It means something a little bit more. I think there have been better performances, but maybe he just encompassed that whole world, that whole life, that whole piece in a way that no one else could possibly hope to do. From the get-go, those 4 notes and the DSCH that permeates through the entire piece, of course. I love the way it doesn't build up to anything. It just goes straight in. First bar, boom, we're right in the middle of what that piece is about in the first bar. I love that.
Yes, although you'd be very surprised if you just heard the performance and never saw the score. It's actually marked piano at the beginning.
Yes.
Not many people play at piano, even students I taught. And I said, that's piano. And then they come to the student concert, it's suddenly forte again. It's not.
Is it marcato though? Does it even?
It's got lines and dot. It depends which edition you use.
Yeah.
I prefer the complete Shostakovich edition.
That's very interesting, because I suppose
it's over every note.
It says so. What you're saying is the temptation is to give it a bit of a oomph at the beginning to make your statement.
It's got oomph, but it's oomph in the distance. That makes it more menacing. It comes closer and closer. Well, we seem to be talking about it quite a lot, even it's not my top 5.
No, it's on mine. No, it's on my list. So, and we do have to talk about it because, as I say, so many people chose it. There must be a reason.
Right.
For that.
So it's the most exciting of all concertos, I think, of all cello concertos. It's a fabulous piece, and again, it's perfect. I think it's fantastic. No. 2 is also an incredible piece.
Yes,
it's very different. And again, it was very satisfying. I was practicing this. I thought that funny, the sort of the phrase that keeps coming back, very tonal phrase in G, keeps coming back in the last movement. I'm sure he's quoting from somewhere. And I remember that he orchestrated, not that distant in time, maybe a couple of years before, Songs and Dances of Death by Mizkowski. So I listened to them. There was that phrase. Now I understand it. Yes.
Okay, so let's come back to that question. I wanted to come back. So because Rostropovich had such an enormous influence over 20th century cello music, not least with the music that he commissioned and the music that was written for him. It seems impossible to imagine 20th century cello concertos without him.
I don't think there's anybody who's done quite as much for their instrument as Rostropovich did for the cello. I mean, Jurkin gets close, I must say, for the violin in the 19th century. But he's the only person, really, about commissioning from other composers. I mean, Rostropovich is extraordinary. And many, well over 100 works, I think he commissioned, of which a fair proportion are masterpieces. I mean, yes. I had to cut out another favorite piece, Britten Cello Symphony, which I think is a profound masterpiece.
Yeah, that's on my list.
Prokofiev Symphonic Concerto, which I don't know so well because I play the concerto, which is the earlier version. And Dutilleux, which I adore. Lutoslawski, I know lots of people love. It's never been quite my favorite. It's not my language, but it's a wonderful piece. I remember the first performance very well. And and so on in the Britten Suites and Walton Passacaglia, I think it's a fantastic piece. And so on, masses of pieces. He was incredible figure. You just couldn't say no to him. I know. I played with him as conductor. You couldn't say no to him.
Yes.
Right. We did the Britain Cello Symphony, I think 4 times in San Francisco. It was great, but it was his tempo.
Yeah, of course.
Slower than the one I had in mind. But it was great. It was
that was certainly the case with him in later years. I think he did an awful lot of the Shostakovich symphonies started to drag for me. That's
they got slow, yes.
Yeah.
But it was for him. He still had that incredible charisma.
Yeah.
The song-side charisma.
Yeah, no question. Richard, you talked eloquently about the Hyden, but it wasn't in fact one of your choices. Tell us one that is one of your choices.
Well, I hope I'm allowed one of the big ones in this in this selection. So I'm just going to jump straight in. I'm going to jump straight in because someone's got to with the Dvorak, because that for me is the big one. That is the number one, the one I love, the Desert Island disc, the only cello concerto I would take to my desert island. And it's quite interesting. A little while ago, Charlotte and I were actually collaborated on an article for Gramophone about Rostropovich's famous recording with Karajan of that concerto. We were basically listening to that concerto recording all over again, deciding it deserved its tremendous reputation. And it sort of rather embarrassingly emerged. I mean, the format of these articles is that sort of one of us says one thing, the other says, "Oh no, I disagree. No, I think quite the opposite." And the problem was we both agreed about pretty much. It just turned into this massive love-in, this sort of 1,200 words, sort of two-way kind of outpouring of absolute love for this recording of this glorious concerto. And I mean, listening to it again with the score at that time, it did strike me how often Rostropovich took liberties, things that I'd always assumed, because this was the only recording I'd ever really listened to much, were in the text, were not in the text. He was speeding things up, he was slowing things down, completely ignoring dynamics. As you just said, like with the Shostakovich concerto, still a totally compelling, wonderful recording, but really, it did occur to me that what I was in love with more than anything was not, as I thought, the recording, but was the piece, which endlessly thrilling. This is the romantic cello concerto for me. It is the grand romantic cello concerto. There are others that are quieter, that are there are others that are gentler, that are more poetic, that are taking a very different approach. But if you want the grand symphonic concerto, it's that Dvorak concerto. Supposedly he's at Niagara Falls when he's in America, and said, "What a symphony in B minor that would make." And of course, he never wrote a symphony in B minor, but this cello concerto is in B minor. And my great dream as a sort of child listening, thinking I might be a cellist, was listening to that massive, sweeping orchestral tutti at the beginning, just sort of crashing and roaring around you. And the cellist who sits there for the best part of 2.5 minutes, just waiting, listening to that in front of everyone, waiting for this moment when everything hushes. Cello comes in. I mean, that's one of those moments that sends shivers up my spine every time. We've got this slow movement, which is deep in the Czech countryside, this idyllic sort of woodwind serenade of a piece with the cello just singing along with it. This finale, which has all these overtones of drama, of conflict, and resolves into this long, lyrical, nostalgic coda, sort of shot through with sadness and melancholy. There's this sort of autobiographical subtext that the concerto that while he was writing it, one of his childhood sweethearts, I think it was his sister-in-law, he received news that she was dying, and in fact she died soon after he completed the work. And he inserted throughout the concerto, he quotes this phrase from a song that he knew he'd written that she particularly loved. And that sort of comes out at the very end, the cello duetting with the violin, the first violin, and then finally refusing to say goodbye at the very end, which obviously gives a cue to so many other great cello concertos. This idea of sort of long, extended farewell, retrospective coda where the cello really goes off into a rhapsody of its own is something that you get in the Elgar Concerto, the Elgar Violin Concerto as well, for that matter. Quite a lot of other great cello concertos, and then he wraps it all up with this stirring flourish. It's absolutely, it's one of those, it's like a symphony. It's a piece that takes you on a huge emotional odyssey. You felt you've lived through a life when you've reached the end of listening to it. And as for playing it, I mean, God knows what atmosphere like. I couldn't begin to imagine.
Well, Stephen, you must have played the Dvorak a lot of times. What are your feelings about it?
Well, he was, of course, on my list as well, of course. Though I just want to say about Rostropovich that actually the first I think it was probably the first piece with which I fell in love, and it was his recording with Bolt. I used to, like Charlotte, I never got to the second or third movements. I used to listen to the first movement again and again and again. But when I told him that, he looked not very pleased. He said, no, better Talich and Ozawa. He didn't mention Carrier. That's what he said. I should listen to those two. I have heard the Talich, I've never heard the Ozawa one. But yes, I mean, I agree. The only thing I don't agree, it's the great romantic concerto. There's Schumann, that will come later. For me, that's romantic in a different sense. The Dvorak is more heroic, of course, and as you say, it's like a symphonic work, or like all concertos, chamber music on a huge scale, and it's a journey. It really is a journey of the soul. And it's interesting, I actually recorded the original version before he wrote that sort of coda in memory of Josefina, his sister-in-law, and he it's interesting, I think he would have revised it. It doesn't work. The cello just sort of dies out in the original version, and then the short coda, which he referred to as stormy in the orchestra, it's not on the same level. And that's the difference with the Elgar. I'm sure Elgar was planning that coda from day one, whereas Dvorak, he really appended it afterwards. It's really got everything that worked. But again, I sort of helped a bit with the Bärenreiter edition, and now I'm about to do a cello part for the Henley edition. I think it's very important we do stick to Dvorak's markings, because they make perfect sense. I mean, one has to differentiate between Dvorak and Wihan, the cellist with whom he collaborated on, although he didn't give the first performance. That was given by an Englishman, Leo Stern. But Dvorak's markings for me make perfect sense. And I think if you pull it around too much, for me, you lose the sense of simplicity of folk music, of dance, which are just in Dvorak's soul. But it's such a great work, and it's so touching. And yeah, it's got everything. It's got this heroic feel. It's got virtuosity, but never just for its own sake, of course. And it has lyricism, but it's deeply, deeply touching. And that coda, and the Elgar coda, actually, and the coda of Frank Bridges' oration. There's a heart-stopping moments, all of them. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing not to love about this concerto. It's so beautiful, it's so sincere, it's also so original, but it does need form, I think. I mean, one can hear performances where it seems to go on forever and ever, because people just pull around. And it's interesting that between the manuscript and the first edition, there are a lot of dynamic changes and note changes and everything. But as far as I remember, no changes in tempo indication. He's very careful about his tempo relationships, and I think that's essential. And the first and second subjects in the first movement, for instance, are not so far apart in the metronome markings. And then the last movement, he's very clear about what he wants. People do ignore it, I think, which is a shame, because I think he knows exactly what he wants. And but it is just a lovable, touching, beautiful work.
Let's move on. Another choice from you, Charlotte.
Well, I'm going to go to Britain for my next choice, but not the one that I think we probably all have on our lists. I'm going to go for another one, the Walton Cello Concerto.
Oh, see, now, you mean Britain, the country?
Yeah.
we're all literally sitting there thinking, hang on, he only wrote one cello concerto.
No, I meant Britain, the country, the United Kingdom, England, perhaps. I'm going to go for the Walton Cello Concerto, which he wrote in 1956. Now, it's funny, this was a work, we have Twitter to thank for this, and particularly Clary, who brought this one up as one of their choices. And it's funny, I love this work, and because it just isn't played all that much, I'd completely forgotten about it. And there was a time when I put it on so much on my CD player, just because it's the most beautiful piece. And so I've been rediscovering it over the past week. And I think that as beginnings of cello concerto goes, this one has to rank right up there at the top. This wonderful, calm, lapping, rocking orchestral introduction, and then this absolutely exquisite, dreamy, long-lined cello solo over the top. Apparently he might have written it as a sort of expression of his love for his wife, describing their relationship, but we don't really know that for sure. But either way, it's a happy work. It's luxurious, it's romantic, and interestingly, it wasn't much adored at the time. It was premiered by the Boston Symphony Orchestra under Munch, and people didn't really get it. And I wonder whether partly, 1956, I wonder whether we trust first audience reactions when they're negative more when they're closer to the present day than we do a couple of centuries ago. We can be frightfully, oh, well, of course, those silly critics didn't know what they were talking about when we're talking about Beethoven's era. But somehow when you get close to the mid-20th century, we kind of think they're more like us and we should believe them. So I wonder, maybe that's one of the reasons why the Walton hasn't really taken off, but it's wonderful. I mean, I could say so much about it, but I think one of my favorite parts is actually the final movement, where this really intriguing, the way it's built. You have two cello cadenzas. You have this wonderful melodic, dreamy opening, and then you have a dramatic cadenza, and then you have this whopping orchestral tutti that's very urgent. None of it's angry though, it's just dramatic. And then another cello cadenza, and then absolute masterstroke, very much like the Elgar. He takes us back to the beginning, and suddenly we're plunged back into this dream world of the start. I think it's the most beautiful way to end a concerto, and the most intriguing way to structure a final movement as well.
Funnily enough, you say about that it is rarely performed or rarely heard. Having had seeing all this love for the Walton Cello Concerto on Twitter, I went back to all my programs to see if I'd ever played it. And funnily enough, in the space of a sort of an 18-month period, I played in 3 separate performances of it.
No way.
And what's interesting about that, I think, is that it perhaps shows fashion a little bit. Because there are fashions for pieces, aren't there? The pieces that you play for what seem like ages, and then suddenly they're gone for an eternity, and then maybe they come back for whatever reason because there's a champion involved, a conductor champions those works or something. But isn't that strange? I mean, and two of those are in the amateur environment, you know, or sort of semi-professional environment, if you like, of that piece. Because I think the viola concerto is probably done a lot, isn't it? With Walton.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
So how interesting that is. Stephen, the Walton Concerto, a piece you know?
Well, I told you at the beginning that my first 4 were no problem, because I've always said my 4 absolute favourite concertos were Schumann, Dvorak, Elgar, and Walton.
Huh.
And I absolutely adore the Walton. And it's funny, Piatigorsky wasn't happy with the ending. When I met Piatigorsky in 1970, he died in 76, so it must be about 71 or something. He was at the Savoy Hotel. I went, with my friend Raphael Valfish, he was there because he was studying Piatigorsky then. And, 73, I think it must be. Anyway, and Piatigorsky was very excited because Walton had just dropped off a new ending to the concerto, because Piatigorsky wanted a loud ending. But apparently, I haven't even heard the revised ending, because Raphael said it's really no point in it. It gets loud and then it gets soft again. So Piatigorsky was very disappointed with that. But why change it? As you say, it's just gorgeous, that ending. Maybe that's the other great coda to a cello concerto. I mean, it's just bathed in moonlight. And it's a stunning piece from first note to last. It's funny, there's a letter from him, from Walton, to his publisher saying, I maybe shouldn't say this, but actually I think my concerto is better than Ben Britten's. He pulls out all the stops, but mine's the real music, which is very unfair on the Cello Symphony, because I didn't like it at first, and now I adore it. I think it's a profound masterpiece. But the Walton, again, it's just so lovable. It just goes straight to your heart. And it's very, because when I recorded it, it was Pavoyevi who didn't know it at all. I said, you've got to learn it, we've got to do it. And we did it in Estonia, in fact, and he fell in love with it. And it's just, and as you say, that amazing tutti in the middle of the last movement between the 2 cadenzas is really like music for Battle of Britain.
Yeah.
Walton wrote, and
it's like one of his film scores.
Yeah, it really is. And then again, it has everything, that piece. It has virtuosity, but not meaningless virtuosity. It has lyricism. It has everything. He's a great composer. I think is still neglected, and because he wasn't in tune with his times by the time he was writing music like that, and he was painfully aware of that, but he just wrote what he had to, and that's why his music will come back.
It's good to hear that, Stephen, because we've had a couple of people, eminent musicians on this program, who've been extremely rude about Walton. And
it's their loss, is all I can say.
Absolutely, quite right.
The Cello Concerto was it was his favourite of his 3 concertos as well.
Well, apparently, I mean, you mentioned it, that Susanna loved it the best because she felt it was a portrait of their love, which you can sort of hear.
You mentioned the Britain Cello Symphony as it took you time to find it, in a way, to get through it. Exactly the same for me. It seems to me that the Cello Symphony is one of those. It's the major Benjamin Britten work that people don't really know.
I know. Colin Matthews thinks it's his absolute masterpiece.
Yeah, but it does take time, because it in a way, if you know lots of other Britten, it's not quite the piece you're expecting. Is that right? Not
a serenade, definitely not. Well, I think you understand it better if you connect it to the War Requiem. There is something that feel to it, I think. And even to the much later Death in Venice, there's a similar passage towards the end. Of course, Death in Venice came much later, but yes, it is a great work. I was wrong not to love it at first.
Well, sometimes these things take time, right?
Yeah, it's like the first sonata of Gabriel Fauré, which is now one of my 2 favorite 20th century cello sonatas. Took me time there. Took me time with the Fauré quartet. You know, it's just, you have to trust a great composer. It took me time with the Walton Passacaglia, which I've just recorded for solo cello. You have to trust, if a great composer leaves a work, not in their sort of childhood or whatever, but they've actually published it and not been ashamed of it, and you don't like it, it's very, very likely to be your fault. Composers do not publish works lightly.
Very true. Richard, let's have another one from you.
Well, I was going. Schumann is on my list, but I think I'd rather leave that for Stephen to talk about, because there's no one I can think of I'd rather hear talk about it. But I'll skip down my list to the slightly. I don't know if any of you know this Cello Concerto by Friedrich Gulder. You might not think this is a very serious choice. I'm not sure it is a very serious choice, but it's a piece like absolutely no other. One that I can't get out of my head. Once you've heard it, you've never forgotten it. Friedrich Gulder, great Austrian piano virtuoso and maverick, supposedly once faxed a news report of his own death to a major newspaper just because he wanted to see everyone run their obituaries and find out what they'd said about him. There are stories that he turned up to recording sessions wearing nothing at all, that sort of thing. He's that kind of chap. And
it's fine, of course, as a cellist, because, you know.
Well, he's a pianist and composer.
Right. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Wow.
What his interest in the cello precisely was, I'm not really sure, except that in 1980 he turned out this absolutely astonishing cello concerto for wind band and a few other bits and pieces and cello. And it's in 5 movements. The first movement begins with this grand dramatic flourish from the cello and cuts straight into what sounds basically a kind of twangy rhythm guitar kicks in, and you're straight into what sounds like the theme from Starsky and Hutch, with a sort of solo cello spiraling around on top of it. And then just when you're sort of thinking, oh my God, I'm listening to a 1970s TV theme masquerading as a cello concerto, it slows right down. There's this rather cheeky little trill, and it just lilts off into this charming Schubertian little serenade accompanied by winds. This is just the first movement. The next movement is a lovely slow movement, just full of a very 19th century sounding slow movement, rather like a Landler, soft woodwinds, lilting, Schubertian, Schumannesque. Then there's this staggering 8-minute long cadenza, just totally unaccompanied in the middle of the piece, with large passages left purely for the cellist to improvise. I mean, Gulder was a great lover of jazz, or convinced that classical music basically had lost that freedom, that eccentricity, that scope for the individual to show off, to be rhythmically free, to be flamboyant. So this colossal 8-minute cadenza, longer than any other movements in the rest of the concerto. Then it goes into a little minuet, again in this classical style. And just when you're thinking, well, this has all settled down rather nicely, we're into the finale, which is a deranged circus gallop. It's bonkers. It just sounds like the soundtrack to a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and with the cello just going crazy over the top of it, and sort of wind band sort of honking away in the background, like it's I don't know, it's sort of Umpar band on speed. It's just it's getting performed more and more. Actually, Nicholas Alstead has recorded it recently, as has Moreau. Quite a few younger cellists seem to be getting quite into this piece. But it is not one I've ever encountered in the concert hall. I would love to do so. I suspect the scoring makes it impractical, quite apart from the fact that, frankly, it's very, very hard to assume it's not some kind of colossal situation of prank, the whole piece. But I just think it must be the most enormous fun to play. And the virtuosity of the thing, the technique, I mean, it is absolutely stretching the cello in every sort of direction. It's, he knew what he was doing in that respect, clearly.
It reminds me, I mean, sounds a little bit in sort of spirit, if you like, to another one that I've been discovering the last week or so, which is Ligeti's Cello Concerto, which is just two movements that sort of run together. But I think it has been described as the anti-concerto, because the cello doesn't really stick out. It's much more a part. I mean, it's very Ligeti, of course, very much part of this sort of overall texture that he's building. And interesting, I mean, like Stephen was saying about the opening of the Shostakovich is actually Mark piano. This starts with the cello with 8 Ps. He writes out 8 P pianos. Now that's quiet, and it's very Ligeti, because it builds from there. He's always finding somewhere that you can build from. But it does feel like an anti-concerto, because actually listening to it, halfway through the first movement, you'd be forgiven for wondering where the cello is. Whereas another very popular choice that was on Twitter that came out was Lutosławski's Cello Concerto, where the first 4 minutes the orchestra doesn't play at all. It is just the cello setting out its stall, and then suddenly the trumpets come in to accompany it. But that's another one. I think that's another classic 20th century work for a cello concerto, is the Lutosławski. Fantastic piece, of short, sort of just over 20 minutes. I think it's rather edge of your seat stuff. It's I find it quite emotional actually as well, but it's very exciting because of all those sounds, a lot of brittle sounds, lots of pizzicatos, lots of very high drums in the percussion. It's all I love the Lutosławski. It's a fabulous piece, and I think it's probably one of his most popular works, maybe the concerto for orchestra as well, but certainly the cello concertos in there. Stephen, before we get to perhaps the Schumann, I just wanted to put you, we had a wonderful tweet from, I have no idea who these people are, but they do the most extraordinary thing. They're called the World Cup of British and Irish 20th and 21st century symphonies at the moment. They suggested their top five cello concertos and remaining in character. They wanted to stress Moran, Finzi, Bax, Walton, and Delius. To which I can only think that's just about the most unlikely top 5 that anyone's ever going to choose. But where do you stand on that?
Well, I don't know them actually. I've unfortunately heard the Delius. It's not my music.
No.
Bax, I'd sort of be interested because I knew Frank Merrick, who knew Bax very well. He sort of got me interested in Bax, but I've never heard it, in fact. Finzi, I keep trying. I know my friend Raphael Valfish adores it, probably be in his top 5. I can't get into it, I must say, but I've never played it. And Walton, very good. Well, yeah, I'm glad Walton's there. But I just wanted to ask Richard, which of the great classic concertos was displaced by Gulda? I only heard this piece once. I had to say, I mean, yes, one never forgets it, but I've never forgotten the first time I saw Psycho either. It wasn't a piece that attracted me, even though it was played by my great and much missed friend, Heinrich Schiff, who obviously was having fun with it, which is great, because Heinrich didn't have enough fun in his life. Yes. So, which is, well, obviously Walton's not there. So you said Hyden wasn't there.
Well, there's a certain amount of triangulation goes on when making these choices. One anticipates what guests and what colleagues might be choosing, and tries to throw the odd surprise in, shall we say? And that is one piece which questionably has made an impact on me, and unquestionably has personality and is like nothing else. I think part of what we're trying to do here is try and, as well as sort of talking about, sharing our views on the masterpieces, we're sort of looking for sort of corners of the repertoire that might surprise people and perhaps give people something to go away and listen to and explore. And I think this is a piece which I laugh out loud every time I listen to it. And there are not many pieces in the repertoire of which one can say that.
Haydn laughs out loud with Hyden. One often laughs out loud with Hyden.
Well, that is true, but we only have 2 Haydn cello concertos to talk about. We all agree that we love them.
Did anybody choose Saint-Saëns? Because I love both Saint-Saëns.
Yes, I was going to ask about the Saint-Saëns. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful pieces.
Yeah.
I think
there are so many we could choose. There are so many we could choose. I mean, that's the beauty of this repertoire, and also therefore the difficulty of this program. Charlotte, sorry, you were going to say.
Oh, I was just going to say with the Golda, I can see where Richard's coming from with that one. But my thing about it is always that I love it, but I couldn't listen to a whole one. It has me laughing. The first.
There is something in that. He's Austrian, isn't he? It's sort of that Central European Germanic tradition. They take a joke and let's say that they never really let go of it, do they?
It to death. Yeah, this is the thing. By the third movement, I'm crying for mercy. I have to switch off. I barely made it much through the second.
He was getting an ovation after a concert once in Vienna, I think, or somewhere, and he gave a Nazi salute.
Oh boy!
His eccentricity was not always lovable. Not that he wasn't at all. He was just making a protest against being enthusiastically received. It's not an attractive story.
No. Let's move on. I did want to ask you, Stephen, about Protecting Veil, because obviously it's a cello solo piece, but it's not called a concerto. So it's not included here. But I did want to ask you about it because it captured something, didn't it? It came out. It was there. There was that time as well, particularly with CDs, where that was really coming into to the fore. There were a number of pieces, new pieces, that did very well on that format and reached a lot of people. And Protecting Veil was one of those. What do you think it was about that piece that caught people?
I don't think I've ever heard of it. Have I? Protecting Veil. Just the beauty. That was it. It is luminous beauty in that piece, and it's got its own time scale. Sometimes it's been a disaster playing it. I used to tell him times I'd been booed and people started fighting in the audience. I had that once in America, and then sometimes you could just feel an audience flying with you, and that was wonderful. But it tended to be in places like the Albert Hall or Minneapolis Cathedral, places like that. Where the greatest experiences were. But it's incredibly well. It's a very simple structure. It's basically a descending F major scale. Each section is based on the next note of the scale, and it's like sort of a series of icons, as he thought, and it's just touching in its beauty. He was just on when he wrote that piece. He was on fire. You can feel it musically. But I mean, I love I've just done this CD of the late works, which I think some of them, all the ones on that disc are stunning as well. You just add a sense of beauty allied to a sense of theatre that speaks to people. And, whether you like it or not, it's your problem. And I don't like all his pieces. But when he was on, it really goes straight to the heart.
And it's a killer opening as well, I think. That's the thing. It draws you straight into that world. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like a big chord playing to draw people in, of course. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Sonorous imagination.
Let's go to Schumann then. Come on, let's give us the Schumann.
Well, the Schumann, I often wonder whether there's ever been quite such an original or profound, a concerto for any instrument, or when I say profound, one who takes you deeper into the inner life. The composer, of course, Dvorak, with a farewell to Josefina, but still, it's very much a grand concerto. Whereas Schumann from the first bars, he treats you like his closest friend and he confides in you. That's why, for me, that is the ultimate romantic concerto, more than even Schumann's violin or piano concertos. There's nothing like that first movement where he just tells you his story, the story of his lives and loves and his heart and his soul. And he just takes you, and he battles his demons in the middle of that first movement. And then he comes out again, and you feel his joy and his pain and his heart beating faster with his syncopations and everything. And the relationship between the solo instrument, which is basically his Eusebius, his inner self, and the orchestral tuttes, which are the outer self, the Floristones. And then it turns really menacing, like the dreams he had as he was revising the proofs of the concerto just in the days before he went to the asylum. It turns menacing in that middle section, and then it comes out again. And then you have paradise in the slow movement. I mean, it takes Wagner an hour in Tristan to create paradise. It takes Schumann about 40 bars. It's just the most satisfying sort of, soul-pleasing slow movement. And then the joyous last moment. But with Schumann, the joy is always sort of shot through with vulnerability, if not pain. And it is a real journey of the soul, and there's nothing like it for any instrument.
Charlotte, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know Stephen's views on the tempo of the slow movement, because I agree with everything that he says, but actually I find this a really problematic first movement. To me, it just feels, I always get worried when a young cellist is proposing this one to play, because this is the ultimate concerto for sounding as though you are trying to swim through a vat of treacle. It's sticky, and I know that there is a school of thought increasingly amongst cellists that actually it should be a faster tempo, it should be far more fluid than it's often played, and that solves a few problems. And so I'd be interested to know from Stephen what he thinks on the whole tempo issue. And I know it's possible to get flow with the slow tempo that most people use, but I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you get there's always, in every piece of music, I think it's fair to say, there's one section that just has to be played at a certain tempo. And that gives you the tempo for the rest of the movement. It's like Sherlock Holmes, you eliminate the impossible, and then you go for the possible. And it's not a slow movement. Schumann wanted originally to put 152 to the crotchet, which is ridiculously fast. Something like that. And the cellist who was writing to him, Bockmuhl, who's a bit of an idiot, I have to say, he said, I want 92. And they compromised on 130. But that's very fast. I mean, the first time this idea was given to me was by an old cellist I knew and adored called Boris Rickelman, who used to be first cellist of the LPO after the war. And he said, it's not a slow movement. He said, everybody plays it like a slow movement, that first movement. It's not. And he's absolutely right. Then I played with Roger Norrington and with John Elliott Gardner. And of course, Roger wanted it much faster. I slowed him down a bit because I don't like the, sticking to the actual metronome mark, because that to me feels hurried. But it's like Thomas Addis says, there's an ideal metronome mark you have in your head, which is actually not how the piece should be played. And I think that's true of the Schumann. It's compromised metronome mark, 130. But yeah, if you play, and then, because it's not a rhapsody, it's a concerto, and it's in sonata form, really. Again, like the Dvorak. Somebody once put it that, if you have a sort of snowball that's loosely packed, you throw it, it'll just fall. If you pack it tightly, it'll go much further. And I think that's true for tempo relationships. They have to be tightly packed. They have to be disciplined, and it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to change tempo. And of course, the first tutti of the Schumann is going to be at a certain tempo to sound natural. And that should be the tempo of your opening as well. And it's not in 4, it's in 2, really. As you can see when you look at it. And I think that's the problem. If people play it self-indulgently, if they decide it's tragic from the first note, they're just wrong. I think. I mean, it's just, you get this wonderful sunrise of those chords at the opening, and then the cello plays and again, if a conductor takes it twice too slowly, those first two, it doesn't make sense, because the cello picks up those chords and spins its melody from those chords. It's the same material, and tells you his love story from that. But it's not tragic at the beginning. It's just romantic. It's full of love and, as I say, vulnerability. But it's only in the middle when it gets tragic. It's like, somebody in a play coming on who's later going to be stabbed. They come on at the beginning of the first act with a dagger inside them and bleeding to death. Doesn't make sense of the play. It's the same with the Schumann Concerto, with many pieces.
I was mentioning about at the beginning about pieces that everybody was mentioning. I mean, Schumann was very much in there on the social media. Of course, it was, but we mentioned it in passing a few times already. But we can't not mention it anymore, and that's the Elgar Concerto. I'm going to start this off. I've never liked it as a piece. I've never got on with it. I've always felt that it just doesn't speak to me. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is just gut instinct with the music itself, of course. I mean, I love Elgar's music, but I never really got on that well with the Cello Concerto. And it may be because I played in so many performances of it, and that can often be the thing that you get bored of it, which is a shame, especially when you're playing it, I think, rather than actually just listening to it as a performance. But also, everybody always accepts that the Jacqueline Dupre performance, oh yes, of course, I mean, it's just a wonderful performance, that's great. And I think in a way that's one of the problems that I have with it, because I think as soon as we have accepted opinion, and this is so prevalent, I think, in our business, that everyone will accept an opinion, and that one of those opinions is that the Elgar is a fantastic concerto and that Jacqueline Dupre's performance is amazing. I think is that we stop listening to it. As soon as we make that decision as a collective force that the Dupre is a brilliant performance and move on, I think we stop listening to other performances. And I think it's worth revisiting as a piece with other performances and finding a way in through that. But there you are. I've said my piece, but I know the Elgar is going to feature in lots of people's top fives. Stephen, the Elgar.
It's a masterpiece. It is a poem of regret. It is, I mean, the thing is, I love that was the first record I ever got, was Dupre and Barbaroli doing the Elgar. And then, of course, I didn't, because I don't spend my time listening to cello concertos, because, I'm going to play them and I don't want to start imitating, which you do consciously or unconsciously if you listen. But then I was actually doing something for gramophone. I guess it was 50th anniversary or something. And first of all, I was recording it with Pavoyevi with the Walton and Holst invocation. So I didn't listen to it. I did listen to the Beatrice Harrison, which is equally wonderful, really, with Elgar conducting. She's fantastic. And then after I recorded it, I thought, okay, I better listen to it. And actually, I did love it. I think she plays it beautifully. And she actually sticks pretty close to the markings, which I think she didn't in later years. Which makes sense, because again, Elgar, like Dvorak, even more than Dvorak, he writes something on almost every note. He writes an instruction. And if you ignore them, I think you ignore them at your peril. Again, I was involved in the Bärenreiter edition, which is not very different, but the history of it, of Elgar putting in his own bowings and just being so careful, going through it with Felix Salmond, who was very unfairly he gave that first performance, which was so badly rehearsed and so was very badly received. It wasn't Felix Salmond's fault at all. I think he was a fantastic cellist, just as good as Beatrice Harrison. They were both wonderful. But no, it's a profound piece, but you're right, it's just been sort of subject, that and the Dvorak particularly subject to cliche. And people just slow the tempo down to the half tempo for no reason.
Yes.
It's not what if Elgar wants something. And then they don't. So there's a bit at the beginning, solo passage where he goes from semiquavers to quavers. And people, including, as I remember, Dupre, just play the same note values. But it's not. It's half as fast, twice as slow, yeah. And when he marks l'argomento, that means something. When he marks our tempo, it means something. And, you know, I mean, you can tell a very good way of telling how careful a composer is at their markings when he puts the same phrase twice. So you get the beginning phrase, and then he brings that back at the end of the last moment. And there's about 10 differences in markings or something. And, you know, if a composer bothers to put that, we have to respect them enough to follow those markings. And they all make perfect sense. He's wonderful. You know, I think the violin concerto by Elgar, I've had to teach that. It's overmarked. I think that's a bit inhibiting for the violinist. But the cello concerto, it's on the verge, but it isn't overmarked. And it's incredibly helpful, in fact. And then if you go, and the thing about Dupré, I mean, she was 20 years old, and it sounds like, and it's wonderful, and her heart absolutely poured through it, and she has this incredible sort of gift for communication, and it's really touching, it's really beautiful, but it's not the only way to approach it. And I've always thought of it as not a man in the present, but a man looking backwards at everything he's lost. It's a real elegy, I think, and that's always how I felt it. And so, yeah, there are other approaches, whatever, which is not to say anything against the beautiful Dupré recording, but
no, and I should make absolutely clear. I think it's a wonderful recording. What I don't like is when people just accept something as something, and then we just have to.
Apparently, she hated it.
Well, there you are. Okay, but look, before we do our little quick roundup, because we've got lots of others to throw in before the end, but. Charlotte and Richard, just a little bit on the Elgar, because I think we probably all agreed that it was certainly going to be in there as one of the Bible and Shakespeare choices. Charlotte?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I tried very hard not to pick it just because it felt rather unoriginal, but I think it's one of the most beautiful openings of a concerto ever written. And I think what really strikes me about it is if you view it in the context of the violin concerto, I think it becomes all that more tragic. That violin concerto written 10 years earlier is this big, noble, warm hug and love letter. And then this one is just this cry of pain. And now whether that was the cry of pain about his wife Alice being on the verge of death at that point, or in her final illness, or Edwardian England disappearing, or the First World War, it could have been so many things. But this is a composer speaking from his heart, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. And it's interesting as well. I mean, that beautiful Scherzo where you have shades of happier Elgar from past lives, and maybe a little bit of Mendelssohn in there as well. I mean, it's beautifully scored. And I think it's very tempting to see this as the stately, slightly dated Old English style in 1918. And I think that we do it a disservice if we hear it like that. I mean, yeah, sure, we'd had the two Prokofiev piano concertos, and Muir was doing Le Boeuf sur la Toile the same year in Paris. But this is something, for me, that's every bit as bold as the two languages that I've just described. And of course, it's very different to say Vaughan Williams' The Lark Ascending, which he'd also just written. So I think that there is a boldness and a modernity to it, which I think we should remember. And of course, I think that's one of the reasons why the premiere was such a disaster, because they couldn't quite get the orchestra together. They couldn't understand it to begin with.
Well, and putting the main theme on the violas at the beginning, maybe
brave.
Yeah.
It's quite brave, and yeah, it's a very interesting bit of orchestration. Richard, very briefly on the Elgar, if you've got anything to say particularly about it, but also as a cellist, but and then can you just throw in a couple of others that you think we should be considering here? Briefly.
Okay, well, the Elgar, and what you say about a particular performance sort of burning a sort of rut into the collective memory is a problem in classical music. It's probably the single most detrimental thing that recording does, I think, for the art. And yeah, I adore the Jacqueline Dupré concerto recording. I came to that like everyone as a teenager. I swept away by it. I was thrilled. And yeah, but it's not the only way to do the Elgar, and it's one of many wonderful ways to do the piece. What you say struck a chord with me, because about a year ago, Shekhar Cannon-Mason released his recording of the Elgar Cello Concerto, and a lot of us were sent copies to have a listen to. And this press release came out saying, "No, he's very much influenced by his great heroine Jacqueline Dupré, and this is a legacy." It's a tribute to Jacqueline Dupré's interpretation of the Elgar Cello Concerto, and of course everyone listened to it, and it was not remotely like Jacqueline Dupré. It was very different, very individual. I actually had the chance to interview him shortly after that, and I said, "Well, this this bit is about Jacqueline du Pré and the Elgar. And obviously, we all love Jacqueline du Pré's Elgar, but yours didn't sound like that to me. Like that was he said, well, no, I was mostly listening to Beatrice Harrison when I was preparing this work. But obviously, they're not going to put that on a press release.
No.
So here we are, and it's silly. It does a disservice to Elgar. It does a disservice to the memory of Jacqueline du Pré and to that wonderful recording. And it stops us listening to work in different ways. I mean, I drove up last summer. I was down in Sussex, and I thought I'll try and find Brinkwell's where he wrote the Cello Concerto. And it was a damp, rainy day in southern England, and we drove up it's very hard to find. It's sort of off a minor road and off another minor road. I was about half an hour out of Chichester, somewhere in the edge of the Downs, and this sort of wooded road that sort of cut through a sort of hollow way up the hillside with trees gathering in. It's gloomy and damp, and there'll be sort of leaves rustling around. And somewhere behind one of these huge hedges was this house, and it's this sense of the darkness of the woodland, the mystery, the fantasy. There's that whole element to the Elgar that people sort of put to one side. I mean, his wife calls his chamber music of that period wood magic. That's a term she used, and there is that element of fantasy, of pastoral, of weirdness about it as well, strangeness, which is in that amazing scoring with subtlety, the shades he brings for the woodwinds, the many sort of different sort of autumnal and twilight hues in that work, and the sort of iridescence, for instance, of the scherzo. It's easy to forget how much sort of colour, how much clarity, how much, as Charlotte says, this kind of spare almost modernity there is to that piece. And if you decide it's just a great outpouring of elegiac passion, I mean, that's in there as well, obviously, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah, talking of the weirdness of the chamber music, of course, the quintet, the first theme, is supposedly inspired by some trees outside his house. He could see there were, by legend, supposed to be the blasted souls of cursed monks on a monastery there. But it's very, very ghostly, and it does seem to represent ghosts. And then he quotes that towards the end of the Cello Concerto. Only
very much so.
Comparatively recently, I said, well, I know why.
Exactly, there's a lot in that piece, but I say Tommy asked me to mention a couple of other pieces to throw in. I wouldn't want to not mention the Mizkowski Cello Concerto. There aren't many big Russian romantic cello concertos that have really got very close to the repertoire. I wouldn't say the Mizkowski is particularly close to the repertoire. It's been recorded a decent number of times. He's a composer we've never mentioned in these talks before now, I don't think. He's sort of I think he seems a kind of second-rate, slightly faded Russian romantic who lived slightly too long. In fact, I mean, it's a very passionate, but also very elegiac work. It's got this, again, like the Elgar, it's elegiac, slow movement and muted colours, which grows and grows, and this passion gradually unfolds. And then this fantastic extended second movement, which includes scherzo, but again also unwinds into another one of these great, passionate, regretful codas. The piece was written in 1945. It doesn't sound like an angry, furious, defiant war symphony, or a great passionate outpouring of loss, but it does feel like there's some deep poetry there, there's some deep sorrow, which is just finding its way out through the voice of the cello. And it's a piece that I think really suits the character of the instrument. And I always find very, very touching whenever I listen to it on record. I've never had the chance to hear it performed live.
Charlotte, very briefly, another one to throw in?
Yeah, I've got two, actually. The first is the Offenbach Grand Cello Concerto Militare. Now, this one, it's a corker. We tend to forget he was such a light music person that we forget that he was a virtuoso cellist who actually won his living as a cellist, a virtuoso cellist, for 20 years before he rented his theatre on the Champs-Élysées. And this one, it's just bonkers. I mean, it's straight off the operatic stage. It's a 43-minute whopper. And it's just so virtuosic. It's ridiculous, extremely lyrical within that. And I liken it to the whole, yes, a fine champagne is a wonderful thing, but every now and then a cheeky Prosecco is just what we need if it's well made. And the first two movements of cheeky Prosecco were kind of heading into cheeky Vimto territory by the time we get to the final, which is just this bonkers military. But it is, and one other little bit I should just tell you about the second movement, which kind of shimmers with the Tales of Hoffmann. And then this crazy duet with a violin. And normally we think of a slow movement duet with another solo orchestra instrument. It's going to be long, it's going to be lyrical, they're going to intertwine with each other. And instead you have this urgent violin basically going bark, bark, bark at it. And the cellists are saying something a little bit more lyrical, and the violin insistently barking. I think, where did he get that? But it's fantastic. And the other one I would just love to mention quickly, and we've talked about the Shostakovich concertos, but the Feinberg cello concerto. And he even actually wove the DSCH motif into it, and they were friends. It's beautiful. I mean, it reminds me slightly of Rachmaninoff's Iron of the Dead at the beginning. You have these wonderful, rich, dark string textures. He makes huge use of the dark woodwind timbres too. And for the cello, it's just this lyrical song. It's heavenly. I can't get enough of it.
There are two others that were mentioned on Twitter that I'm looking for. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to discovering. One is Shedrin. I love Shedrin's music, always fun. His cello concerto, and Kachachurian as well is another one I'm looking forward to going to. Now, Stephen, as we wrap up, we mentioned about Protecting Veil was written for you, and you did the premiere, of course. You've premiered a lot of pieces. Do you ever feel very proprietorial over the pieces that have been written for you when other people do them? How does it feel when other people start to play your pieces?
Well, yeah, you do feel it's like with Tom Ades, we've been doing the orchestral version of his Le Retrouvé for cello, and he occasionally makes points, things he wants. And once or twice I've looked at him, I said, I've known this piece since before you were born, which is not very logical, but I feel so much involved in these pieces. But of course, I'm happy if they take off. And the Protecting Veil took off. Not so many performances recently, and Tom's piece and Kurtag's pieces that he's written for me should take off, and so on. Yeah, can I mention two? I mentioned them in passing, but
you can throw them in.
Dutieux, which I think is a fabulous, poetic, wonderful piece. Just every note in its place, and he felt it was his masterpiece, and I find it takes you to a wonderful, beautiful world. I love that. And I did mention it earlier, and I just didn't want to be so jingoistic to choose three British pieces, but Bridge Oration, Frank Bridge Oration, which I think is that's a true neglected masterpiece, and actually a great companion for the Elgar, because it's so different. Elgar has the melodies you remember, it's incredibly touching, and Bridge is much more cinematic. Elgar's an elegy for the First World War, I think, and what was lost, and Bridge takes you onto the battlefield. I mean, it's really like it's almost traumatic, and then at the end, the soldiers, you actually hear the point in the piece where the soldier is killed, and then the coda, his soul floats to heaven, and that's a masterpiece too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Frank Bridge always put in the shadow of his more famous pupil, perhaps. But yeah, we should get more of that on this show. Stephen, thank you so much for choosing your top five. Absolutely fascinating. And as always, I shall be putting up the Spotify playlist of the music that we've been mentioning in the program. So look out for that. And for the first time, you can also watch us, as this whole podcast is available in video form as well. So prepare to have your imaginations shattered as you see what we really look like. You'll find the video on our Facebook page and on YouTube, links via Twitter and Facebook as always. Now, next week, we tackle a subject that you have chosen for us via our Classical Top 5 Twitter poll. Now, we asked you which subject from three choices you'd most like to hear us feature next. The choices were male voices, solos in orchestral works, and film scores, all subjects we will certainly be featuring at some point. It was a close run thing between film scores and solos in orchestral works, as it turns out, but thanks to all of you who voted, it was solos in orchestral works that won with 46% of the vote. So that's what we'll be choosing next week. Don't forget to recount. Well, I think Richard certainly wanted a recount. Anyway, well, don't forget to let us know your top 5 solos in orchestral works. What are those arresting or exciting or just beautiful solos from within the orchestra that you cannot resist? You tell us on Twitter at Classical Top 5 or on our Facebook page, as always. Thanks again to Steven Isserlis for joining us, and to Charlotte and Richard as always. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.